The Battle of the Atlantic before 1941 was not merely a contest of ships and submarines, but the foundational struggle that determined whether Britain could continue to exist as a viable force against Nazi Germany, shaping the very trajectory of the Second World War long before American entry or the height of U-boat warfare. It was, in essence, a vast, unending campaign fought across millions of square miles of restless ocean, where merchant ships became lifelines, destroyers became guardians, and submarines became predators lurking beneath the waves. When war broke out in September 1939, few could have predicted that control of the Atlantic sea lanes, those vital arteries carrying food, oil, weapons, and raw materials, would soon become the decisive front upon which Britain's survival would depend. The early phase of this struggle emerged from the lessons and legacies of the First World War. U-boats had come close to starving Britain into submission in 1917, and although the convoy system had eventually turned the tide, the interwar years saw a dangerous complacency within both the British Admiralty and political leadership. Resources were scarce, naval budgets were tight, and new technologies like radar and shipborne ASDIC, or sonar, were promising but immature. Germany, meanwhile, had studied its previous failures with meticulous care. Even though Hitler did not initially envision a prolonged maritime war with Britain, Admiral Karl Dönitz had spent the 1930s refining U-boat tactics, advocating for a massive submarine fleet built around coordinated attacks and envisioning the wolfpack doctrine as the key to breaking British resistance. Thus, when war erupted, Germany possessed neither the numbers nor the full technological advantage it would later enjoy, but it did possess clear strategic aims, disciplined commanders, and a willingness to exploit every weakness in British preparations. The first months of the conflict demonstrated just how vulnerable the Atlantic lifeline was. Submarines sank passenger liners, merchant ships, and unescorted freighters with shocking efficiency, while German surface raiders, including armed merchant cruisers and powerful pocket battleships, roamed the oceans with a freedom that stunned British planners. The sinking of the passenger liner Athenia on the very first day of the war signaled that the Atlantic would quickly become a battlefield, and the loss of the aircraft carrier Courageous and battleship Royal Oak soon reminded the Admiralty that no ship, no matter its size, was beyond the reach of Germany's new naval strategy. Yet the British response in these early years was marked by improvisation, adaptation, and the struggle to apply lessons faster than Germany could exploit them. The convoy system, initially employed cautiously due to shortages of escorts, soon became mandatory as independent ships fell prey in alarming numbers. British intelligence agencies, still in the early stages of expansion, began intercepting and analyzing German naval communications, while Bletchley Park slowly built the expertise that would later unlock the Enigma code. These early, fragile efforts laid the groundwork for the massive intelligence breakthroughs to come, but they were not yet enough to reduce the mounting losses. Meanwhile, Germany capitalized on surface raiders, ships like the Admiral Graf Spee, Deutschland, and various auxiliary cruisers, which blended deception, speed, and long-range striking power to disrupt commercial traffic far beyond the North Atlantic. The chase, battle, and scuttling of the Graf Spee in December 1939 was one of the first dramatic turning points of the naval war, illustrating both the threat posed by such ships and the determination of Britain and its Commonwealth partners to confront them wherever they appeared. But with the fall of France in June 1940, the entire balance of the Atlantic War shifted. Germany now gained direct access to Atlantic ports, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, from which its U-boats could operate with far greater reach, endurance, and efficiency. No longer forced to thread the narrow, heavily defended North Sea, U-boats could now surge into the open ocean, cutting across convoy routes and striking at points where Britain lacked sufficient escorts or long-range air cover. This geographic advantage alone increased the lethality of the German submarine force, but it coincided disastrously with Britain's period of greatest vulnerability. The Royal Navy was stretched thin across multiple theaters, escort ships were in catastrophically short supply, and the Luftwaffe's pressure during the Battle of Britain strained British industry and shipbuilding. At the same time, Dönitz's expanding U-boat fleet began implementing wolfpack tactics more effectively, coordinating night surface attacks in which submarines operated like fast torpedo boats, invisible to ASDIC and deadly against lightly defended convoys. Even with the increasing use of radar and improved direction-finding techniques, Britain found itself reacting rather than shaping events, trying desperately to protect shipments of food, fuel, and war materials that were now being consumed faster than they could be replaced. The crisis intensified during the winter of 1940-41 when German U-boats, operating from French bases, supported by improved logistics, and guided by more effective radio intelligence, inflicted some of the heaviest losses of the war to date. The Royal Navy and Merchant Marine faced a dilemma. Escorts were too few, merchant ships too vulnerable, and the industrial capacity to replace losses too limited. Yet, in the midst of this crisis, new forms of aid and collaboration began to emerge. Canada expanded its naval forces with remarkable speed, transforming itself into a major escort power. The United States, still officially neutral, began supplying destroyers through the 1940 Destroyers for Bases Agreement, and its Navy increased Atlantic patrols that indirectly shielded convoys approaching North America. These efforts did not immediately solve the crisis, but they prevented collapse and kept the British war machine supplied at a moment when defeat seemed possible. At the same time, Britain's scientific institutions accelerated innovation, improved sonar, shipborne radar, HF-DF radio direction finding, and early air-to-surface radar all entered experimental or limited operational service, forming the technological backbone of later Allied dominance. These early fragile efforts laid the groundwork for the massive intelligence breakthroughs to come, but they were not yet enough to reduce the mounting losses. Meanwhile, Germany capitalized on surface raiders, ships like the Admiral Graf Spee, Deutschland, and various auxiliary cruisers, which blended deception, speed, and long-range striking power to disrupt commercial traffic far beyond the North Atlantic. The chase, battle, and scuttling of the Graf Spee in December 1939 was one of the first dramatic turning points of the naval war, illustrating both the threat posed by such ships and the determination of Britain and its Commonwealth partners to confront them wherever they appeared. But with the fall of France in June 1940, the entire balance of the Atlantic War shifted. Germany now gained direct access to Atlantic ports, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, from which its U-boats could operate with far greater reach, endurance, and efficiency. No longer forced to thread the narrow, heavily defended North Sea, U-boats could now surge into the open ocean, cutting across convoy routes and striking at points where Britain lacked sufficient escorts or long-range air cover. This geographic advantage alone increased the lethality of the German submarine force, but it coincided disastrously with Britain's period of greatest vulnerability. The Royal Navy was stretched thin across multiple theaters, escort ships were in catastrophically short supply, and the Luftwaffe's pressure during the Battle of Britain strained British industry and shipbuilding. At the same time, Dönitz's expanding U-boat fleet began implementing wolfpack tactics more effectively, coordinating night surface attacks in which submarines operated like fast torpedo boats, invisible to ASDIC and deadly against lightly defended convoys. Even with the increasing use of radar and improved direction-finding techniques, Britain found itself reacting rather than shaping events, trying desperately to protect shipments of food, fuel, and war materials that were now being consumed faster than they could be replaced. The crisis intensified during the winter of 1940-1941, when German U-boats, operating from French bases, supported by improved logistics and guided by more effective radio intelligence, inflicted some of the heaviest losses of the war to date. The Royal Navy and Merchant Marine faced a dilemma. Escorts were too few, merchant ships too vulnerable, and the industrial capacity to replace losses was too limited. Yet, in the midst of this crisis, new forms of aid and collaboration began to emerge. Canada expanded its naval forces with remarkable speed, transforming itself into a major escort power. The United States, although officially neutral, began supplying destroyers through the 1940 Destroyers for Bases Agreement. In the opening months of the Second World War, the Atlantic Ocean emerged as the decisive arena in which the survival of Britain, and ultimately the fate of the wider struggle, would be contested. For the strategic stakes that defined the period between 1939 and 1940 hinged on the ability of the British Isles to maintain a lifeline of food, raw materials, and military supplies drawn from the far-reaching resources of its global empire and from sympathetic neutral nations such as the United States. The British government understood with complete clarity that the Royal Navy, long celebrated as the world's preeminent maritime force, was now faced with a challenge unlike any it had endured in the previous century. An adversary that sought not to defeat it in a decisive fleet battle, but rather to strangle it into submission by waging a ruthless war on merchant shipping. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, recognized that it could never hope to rival Britain ship for ship, but it could exploit the vulnerabilities of maritime commerce by deploying a combination of submarines, surface raiders, and mines designed to transform the Atlantic into a lethal battlefield where even a single torpedo could undermine Britain's capacity to endure. The Kriegsmarine, still in the early stages of mobilization due to the limitations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles and by Hitler's own initial focus on land campaigns, began the war with a relatively small force of operational U-boats. Yet their commanders understood that even a modest submarine arm could inflict disproportionate damage if used with daring, precision, and tactical innovation. As diplomatic tensions escalated throughout 1939, the German Naval High Command prepared to apply pressure on Britain's extended supply routes, relying on wolfpack tactics still in their infancy and on long-range reconnaissance aircraft tasked with shadowing convoys from the air. Britain, aware of the looming danger, attempted to refine the convoy system that had proved essential during the First World War, though many within the Admiralty remained divided over the extent to which convoys should be implemented at the outset of hostilities. In the months before open war erupted, British intelligence officers and naval planners debated how best to counter an enemy whose doctrine emphasized stealth, endurance, and the exploitation of vast ocean spaces in which submarines could lurk unseen. The outbreak of war on September 1, 1939, transformed theoretical discussions into immediate operational necessity, as German U-boats commenced their campaign under rules that initially required commanders to adhere to prize regulations, which obligated them to surface, examine merchant ships, and take steps to safeguard civilian crews before sinking a vessel. But these restrictions quickly became untenable in an environment where merchant ships could be armed, radio-equipped, or escorted by warships, and so the early months saw an accelerating erosion of restraint on both sides. The sinking of the passenger liner SS Athenia by U-30 on the very first day of the war provided a grim indication of how quickly misunderstandings, miscalculations, or moments of overzealousness could inflame public opinion and shape the moral contours of the conflict. Britain responded by formalizing the use of defensive measures such as the requisitioning of civilian vessels, the establishment of convoy routes between home ports and strategic hubs like Gibraltar and Halifax, and the introduction of coastal blackouts and minefields designed to impede enemy access to vulnerable waters. Simultaneously, neutral states were thrust into the diplomatic crossfire of naval warfare, particularly the United States, which sought to uphold its policy of neutrality while still recognizing that Britain's survival aligned with its own long-term security interests. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, sympathetic to the British cause, monitored the escalating threat in the Atlantic with a keenness that would eventually translate into legislative and material support. Meanwhile, Germany faced its own internal debates over the pace and scale of naval operations, as Grand Admiral Erich Raeder urged Hitler to maximize the strategic opportunity before Britain fully mobilized its defenses. Yet the Kriegsmarine remained constrained by limited resources and by the reality that the early war period required balancing U-boat operations with the deployment of surface raiders such as the pocket battleships Graf Spee and Deutschland, which were expected to disrupt trade routes while sowing confusion and dispersing British naval efforts. The interplay between doctrine, technology, and political calculation defined the evolving tempo of the war at sea, and by late 1939, it was evident that the Battle of the Atlantic would not be a short or localized confrontation, but rather a sustained campaign that would stretch the endurance, innovation, and resolve of all participants. The winter of 1939-1940 revealed that Britain's vulnerabilities were far more severe than many peacetime planners had anticipated, as the Royal Navy struggled to escort thousands of merchant vessels across a vast oceanic domain while simultaneously supporting amphibious operations, blockades, and commitments in the Mediterranean. German U-boats achieved early successes not through overwhelming numbers, but by exploiting gaps in British coverage, nighttime attacks on the surface, and intelligence gleaned from weather patterns and shipping routes. Each sinking carried consequences measured not only in tonnage, but also in strategic anxiety, for the loss of supply ships threatened industrial output, food distribution, and the sustainment of military operations worldwide. The psychological dimension of the campaign grew increasingly evident as newspapers chronicled the dangers faced by merchant sailors and the heroic efforts of rescue crews operating in hostile waters. Naval officers, meanwhile, confronted the sobering realization that technological advancements from sonar, ASDIC, to air reconnaissance, though valuable, were still insufficient to guarantee safe passage against a determined and adaptive enemy. The first U-boat offensive that unfolded between late 1939 and the spring of 1940 marked a dramatic awakening for Britain and its allies to the modern realities of submarine warfare, for this early campaign exposed not only the tactical brilliance of German U-boat commanders, but also the vulnerabilities of maritime supply systems that had not yet adapted to the new technologies and doctrines that defined the Second World War at sea. The Kriegsmarine, though numerically inferior to the Royal Navy, initiated its submarine operations with a mixture of caution, innovation, and opportunism, relying on a small but highly trained cadre of U-boat crews whose commanders were steeped in the lessons of the First World War, while also pioneering new methods suited to the evolving battle space. These early U-boats, primarily Type 7 and Type 9 classes, were far from the vast submarine fleets Germany hoped to eventually field, yet their impact was immediate and disproportionate, fueled by daring night surface attacks, improved torpedo technology, and coordinated tactical doctrine that emphasized stealth and precision. Britain, on the other hand, entered the conflict with an assumption that the lessons of the First World War, particularly the successful development of convoys, would suffice to counter the submarine menace. However, the reality proved far different, for not all merchant vessels were initially placed into convoys, and the Royal Navy faced enormous difficulties in assigning adequate escorts to routes stretching from the North Atlantic to the western approaches. The chapter of the Atlantic conflict, dominated by German surface raiders, and, above all, the dramatic saga of the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, represents one of the most striking demonstrations of how a single capital ship, properly deployed, could destabilize global shipping routes, stretch Allied naval resources to their limits, and challenge Britain's centuries-old mastery of the sea. The period from 1939 to late 1940 witnessed a revival of commerce raiding strategies that had deep historical roots in German naval thought, stemming from the First World War and further influenced by the writings of naval theorists who understood that Germany, lacking numerical superiority, must instead rely on asymmetric tactics designed to disperse the Royal Navy. Unlike submarines, whose stealth and endurance allowed them to operate largely unseen, surface raiders functioned by blending into the sea lanes through deception, mobility, and carefully selected engagements. The Kriegsmarine deployed a mixture of heavily armed pocket battleships, auxiliary cruisers disguised as merchant vessels, and fast warships intended to prey on the vulnerable trade arteries connecting Britain with its empire and essential supply partners in South America, the Indian Ocean, and beyond. At the heart of this maritime drama stood the Admiral Graf Spee, commanded by Captain Hans Langsdorff, whose professionalism, tactical restraint, and adherence to prize regulations earned him a reputation distinct from the more aggressive U-boat commanders who often operated beyond customary rules of engagement. The Graf Spee, equipped with 6 11-inch guns, powerful diesel engines granting it long operational range, and advanced fire control systems, embodied Germany's belief that a handful of such vessels could force the Royal Navy to scatter its forces across thousands of square miles of ocean, weakening its ability to concentrate power where needed. In the early months of the war, Langsdorff executed this mission with notable strategic finesse, sinking or capturing numerous merchant ships while minimizing civilian casualties and avoiding unnecessary confrontations with superior British forces. His actions sowed confusion across Allied shipping lanes, prompting the formation of multiple hunting groups composed of cruisers, destroyers, and battleships, rushed from distant theaters to locate and neutralize the elusive raider. These search operations came at considerable operational cost, diverting warships urgently required for convoy protection and North Sea patrols. The British Admiralty, recognizing the destabilizing effect of a single enemy ship capable of inflicting strategic disruption on a global scale, intensified its intelligence operations, drawing on radio intercepts, merchant ship reports, and aerial reconnaissance to narrow the search perimeter. Meanwhile, auxiliary raiders such as Atlantis and Cormoran carried out parallel operations, disguising themselves with false flags, dummy structures, and deceptive profiles that enabled them to lurk near trade routes and approach unsuspecting ships with ruses honed over decades of maritime warfare. These vessels, although less powerful than the pocket battleships, posed significant danger because they blended seamlessly with commercial traffic and had the advantage of surprise. Yet it was the Graf Spee's pursuit that captured global attention, culminating in the Battle of the River Plate, the first major naval engagement of the Second World War. After months at sea, the German raider was intercepted off the coast of South America by a squadron of 3 British cruisers under Commodore Henry Harwood, HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles. Despite being outnumbered, Langsdorff fought with determination, inflicting heavy damage on Exeter and sustaining considerable damage in return. Realizing that the ship could not endure further combat without repairs, Langsdorff withdrew to the neutral ports of Montevideo, Uruguay, setting in motion a complex diplomatic and strategic struggle that unfolded in full view of the international press. British intelligence, determined to prevent the Graf Spee from escaping, mounted an elaborate deception operation that convinced Langsdorff he faced a superior force waiting just beyond the harbor. Bound by international law that limited the duration of his stay, and unwilling to risk the lives of his crew in a hopeless battle, Langsdorff made the fateful decision to scuttle the Graf Spee on December 17, 1939. The dramatic explosion of the raider in the Rio de la Plata became one of the most iconic moments of the early war, symbolizing both the ingenuity of British naval strategy and the moral complexity of Langsdorff's command decisions. He took his own life shortly thereafter, leaving behind a legacy of honorable conduct amid a brutal war. Britain hailed the outcome as a tremendous victory, not only because it neutralized a dangerous raider, but also because it demonstrated to neutral nations, particularly in South America, the reach and resolve of Allied naval power. The destruction of the Graf Spee also exposed deep strategic truths that would shape the remainder of the Atlantic campaign. Surface raiders, though formidable, could not operate indefinitely without support. Global naval coordination and intelligence sharing were essential, and commerce raiding, while capable of temporary disruption, could not alone bring Britain to its knees. Nonetheless, German raiders continued to operate into 1940, scoring impressive successes in the Indian Ocean and North Atlantic, but gradually facing increasing pressure as Britain refined its tracking methods and integrated intelligence breakthroughs into its maritime strategy. The chapter of surface raiders ultimately stands as a powerful reminder that the Battle of the Atlantic was not solely a duel between submarines and convoys, but also a complex struggle involving deception, endurance, global logistics, and the profound psychological impact of lone warships capable of reshaping naval priorities across the world's oceans. As the Battle of the Atlantic intensified during 1939 and 1940, Britain found itself compelled to rethink, refine, and ultimately revolutionize the defensive measures that had been pieced together during the First World War. The convoy system, long debated inside the Admiralty, moved from being a partial, cautiously applied practice to the central pillar of maritime strategy, upon which the survival of the British Isles would depend. In the early months of the war, lingering doubts about the efficiency of convoys, concerns over escort shortages, and institutional resistance within some naval circles had slowed full implementation. Yet the mounting losses inflicted by U-boats and surface raiders rapidly swept aside any hesitation. It became clear that only by concentrating merchant vessels under armed protection could Britain ensure a defensible, measurable, and predictable flow of supplies from the far corners of its empire and from increasingly vital partners like Canada and the United States. Each convoy that crossed the Atlantic represented not merely a logistical movement, but an assertion of Britain's refusal to be strangled into submission. Convoys required intricate coordination, assembling ships of varying speeds, calculating routes designed to evade known U-boat patrol lines, and assigning destroyers, sloops, corvettes, and auxiliary vessels to shepherd them through waters that grew more dangerous by the week. In these early stages, the Royal Navy was acutely aware of its shortages: too few escort ships, too few trained crews, and too vast an ocean to cover. To address this, Britain accelerated wartime construction programs, converting civilian vessels into makeshift escorts and calling upon its Commonwealth partners to reinforce the shrinking screen of protection surrounding its merchant fleet. The development of the Flower-class corvettes, small, versatile, rapidly producible ships, played an essential role in expanding the escort force. Though cramped, slow, and often battered by harsh Atlantic storms, these vessels quickly became the bedrock of convoy defense. Alongside convoy expansion came a surge in British innovation in intelligence collection and cryptoanalysis. The Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center, OIC, worked tirelessly to compile information from radio intercepts, shipping reports, and air reconnaissance to map U-boat positions. German radio communications, though initially secure, contained patterns and procedural habits that experienced analysts could exploit even before decisive code-breaking breakthroughs arrived. Direction finding, HFDF, known colloquially as Huff Duff, became an invaluable tool in locating radio transmissions from U-boats coordinating attacks or reporting to their command. Shore stations and escorts equipped with HFDF could triangulate these signals, revealing approximate U-boat positions and enabling convoys to reroute around danger. Although early technology was imperfect, it marked a dramatic evolution in maritime awareness and laid the groundwork for more sophisticated systems that would come later. Meanwhile, Britain's emerging radar technology, still in its infancy, began to show its strategic worth. Coastal radar stations provided early warning of enemy aircraft and assisted in tracking surface vessels attempting to slip through the North Sea or the western approaches. Shipborne radar, though limited to a small number of warships during 1939 to 1940, represented a revolutionary advance in night engagements and poor weather conditions. Radar-enabled escorts could detect surfaced U-boats even in darkness, undermining Admiral Karl Donitz's favored tactic of night surface attacks. Although U-boats still enjoyed significant advantages during this stage of the war, radar's potential was unmistakable, prompting rapid investment in research, deployment, and operator training. Britain's intelligence apparatus underwent a parallel transformation, as Bletchley Park expanded its capabilities, recruiting mathematicians, linguists, puzzle solvers, and naval veterans to interpret, decrypt, and synthesize vast quantities of enemy communications. While the full breakthrough into Germany's naval enigma codes was not yet achieved in this period, incremental progress and vital captures, often from daring Royal Navy boarding operations, provided the foundation for later triumphs that would shift the balance of the Atlantic War. Alongside these technical and operational advances, Britain recognized the necessity of strengthening coordination with its allies. Canada emerged as an indispensable partner, expanding its navy, providing escorts, and supporting the massive flow of goods through Halifax, which became one of the world's busiest wartime ports. The United States, though formally neutral before late 1941, gradually increased its involvement through patrols, intelligence sharing, and later through the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, which transferred 50 aging but desperately needed U.S. destroyers to Britain. The fall of France in June 1940 marked a dramatic escalation in the Battle of the Atlantic, transforming what had already been a perilous maritime struggle into a full-scale crisis that threatened the very survival of Britain. Until this moment, German U-boats operated primarily from Baltic and North Sea bases, limiting their range, endurance, and operational flexibility. But with France's defeat, Hitler acquired a chain of Atlantic ports, Lorient, Brest, La Rochelle, Saint-Nazaire, and Bordeaux, that provided direct access to deep Atlantic waters. These new bases, soon fortified with massive concrete pens, allowed U-boats to bypass the heavily guarded northern approaches and deploy more rapidly into the central Atlantic shipping lanes, where Allied defenses were thinner and convoys more vulnerable. The strategic ramifications were immediate and devastating. For the first time, the Kriegsmarine could launch sustained, coordinated operations far from British air cover, extending patrol durations and increasing both the frequency and intensity of attacks. Admiral Karl Donitz saw the fall of France as the opportunity he had long anticipated, a chance to unleash the full potential of U-boat warfare. Although Germany still lacked the hundreds of submarines he believed necessary to defeat Britain outright, the improved basing situation multiplied the effectiveness of the boats already at his disposal. The result was a surge of U-boat activity that outpaced British defensive responses, creating what became known as the First Happy Time for German submariners. U-boat captains, many of them veterans trained in the interwar years, exploited gaps in convoy coverage and the vastness of the mid-Atlantic, an area soon labeled the Black Pit due to the absence of Allied air patrols. Merchant losses climbed sharply, with entire convoys mauled during night attacks, executed on the surface, where U-boats could maneuver with speed and stealth. The Royal Navy struggled desperately to adapt. Escort ships were too few, air cover too limited, and detection technology still inconsistent. Britain raced to strengthen its escort fleet by commissioning new destroyers, corvettes, and armed trawlers. The Flower-class corvettes, small and comparatively simple to build, emerged as a crucial stopgap. While not ideal fighting ships, they rolled heavily in rough seas and lacked speed. They were invaluable as convoy escorts. Yet even as new ships entered service, the operational demands far outstripped capacity. The loss of France not only provided Germany with new bases, but also deprived Britain of a key ally, whose navy, merchant fleet, and coastal infrastructure had previously supported Atlantic operations. Now Britain stood alone against the combined naval pressure of U-boats, surface raiders, and the Luftwaffe's growing presence along the Biscay coast. Compounding the crisis was the threat posed by German capital ships, Bismarck, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, which now had direct access to the Atlantic. Although the U-boat campaign posed the deadliest long-term challenge, the possibility of a breakout by these ships forced Britain to divert warships away from convoy duty to guard against surface raiders capable of inflicting catastrophic losses. The Royal Navy was stretched to its limits, pulled between convoy escort, blockade enforcement, Mediterranean commitments, and home defense. Meanwhile, British intelligence and code-breaking operations, though improving, had not yet reached their full maturity. Bletchley Park's naval section still struggled to consistently break the Kriegsmarine's Enigma traffic, especially after the introduction of improved encryption procedures. HFDF stations provided intermittent insights into U-boat positions, but these remained difficult to exploit fully due to the limited number of escorts equipped with direction-finding gear. Air reconnaissance, essential for spotting and deterring submarines, was hampered by range limitations that left vast expanses of the Atlantic virtually unmonitored. Coastal Command aircraft, flying outdated or under-equipped planes, lacked both the endurance and the technology, such as airborne radar and lee lights, that would later transform their effectiveness. The human toll on merchant sailors was immense. Crews operating in the North Atlantic faced freezing waters, storms, the constant threat of torpedoes, and the grim knowledge that rescue was never guaranteed. Convoys that came under attack often did so at night, with U-boats striking from multiple directions, sinking ships within minutes and retreating before escorts could counterattack. The psychological strain of sailing through hostile waters produced widespread fear and exhaustion, yet merchant mariners continued their voyages with remarkable resilience, knowing that Britain's survival depended upon their courage. As losses mounted, the British government launched recruitment, training, and welfare programs to sustain the merchant fleet, while propaganda efforts highlighted the heroism of those who carried vital supplies across the ocean. The United States, though still officially neutral, expressed growing alarm at the deteriorating situation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's policy of all aid short of war began to materialize in the form of intelligence sharing, expanded patrol zones, and eventually the transfer of destroyers to Britain in exchange for Atlantic bases. These American-built destroyers, though aging, were immediately pressed into service, filling critical gaps in convoy escorts during a moment when Britain could least afford weakness. The agreement also provided the U.S. Navy with a strategic foothold in the Atlantic that would later prove indispensable once America entered the war. By early 1941, the Atlantic crisis had reached its peak. U-boat successes mounted month by month, merchant losses strained Britain's economy, and the threat of invasion, though diminishing after the Battle of Britain, remained real enough to demand significant naval resources for home defense. Yet amidst the crisis, seeds of eventual Allied triumph were taking root. New escort ships joined the fleet. Radar and sonar technologies steadily improved. Intelligence breakthroughs advanced step by step. RAF Coastal Command expanded its operational reach, and American involvement deepened,